The wind howled across the frozen expanse, whipping through the trees and rattling the windows of my cabin. It wasn't much. A single room built from rough timber, standing at the edge of the forest where the trees grew thick and dark. Beyond that was nothing but snow, a vast white sheet that stretched toward the distant mountains. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the wood, settling under the weight of frost, and the soft crackle of the fire inside. Outside, it was as if the world had fallen silent, swallowed by the endless winter. I had moved to this part of the Nordic countryside years ago, when I was younger, full of the kind of romantic notions people get when they want to escape the noise of the city. The quiet here was different. It wasn't peaceful or serene. It was heavy. Oppressive, almost. The closest village was a good few kilometers away, just a scattering of houses and a small church, its steeple barely visible in the snowdrifts. Maybe 100 people lived there, mostly farmers or old folks who had been here all their lives. I wasn't from here. I came for the solitude. I stayed for the isolation. The winters were long and brutal. The sun barely showed its face, just a dim glow at the horizon for a few hours before sinking back into the dark. The snow came early this year, thicker than usual, burying everything under a heavy white blanket. It was a cold that sank deep into your bones, a chill that even the fire struggled to keep at bay. I'd grown used to the routine. Wake up, chop wood, keep the fire burning, and wait for spring. But there was something different about this winter. Something in the air, colder than usual. It wasn't just the temperature. It was an unease, a creeping sense that the quiet wasn't so empty after all. The trees that ringed my cabin felt like they were closing in, their branches twisting together in ways that made them seem almost alive, like dark fingers reaching toward the sky. I told myself it was just the winter playing tricks on me. Isolation does strange things to the mind. After weeks of silence, you start to hear things that aren't there. Or at least, you hope they aren't. The village folk had their own way of explaining these feelings. I'd hear the old men at the tavern whisper about the winter spirits when they thought no one was listening. Superstition ran deep here, older than the church and far more ingrained in the people's bones. They didn't talk about it much in the daylight, but at night, when the wind was howling and the darkness felt like it had teeth, the old stories would come out. Ghosts of warriors long dead, creatures of the woods, things that lived in the shadows beyond the firelight. They'd always laugh it off after a drink or two, but their eyes would dart toward the windows just for a second, as if they weren't quite sure. I didn't believe in any of that, not really, or at least I hadn't. The cabin sat at the end of a long, narrow path that cut through the trees. I built it myself, hauling lumber from the forest in the early summer months when the snow had finally melted. It was sturdy, meant to keep out the worst of the cold. But on nights like these, when the wind screamed like it was alive and the sky pressed down low, even the walls felt too thin. I spent most of my time alone, working in silence. It was a simple life, but that's what I wanted. The villagers didn't come out here often, too far, too cold, and too little reason to. I only went into town for supplies, maybe once every few weeks, just enough to stock up on food and fuel. Other than that, I had everything I needed right here, or so I thought. Lately, though, something had been gnawing at me, a feeling deep in my gut, like I was being watched. At first, I brushed it off as the effects of the isolation, the long, dark hours with nothing but my own thoughts for company. But then I started noticing things, small things, barely enough to call strange, but just enough to unsettle me. A pile of wood disturbed, tracks in the snow that led too close to the cabin, like something or someone had been out there, circling. I told myself it was nothing. The woods were full of animals, and I wasn't the only one living in these hills. But as the days grew shorter and the nights stretched on endlessly, that feeling didn't go away. It grew. Something was out there. I could feel it. It started small, just little things you wouldn't even notice unless you were out here alone, day after day. The kind of things most people would write off as accidents or the work of animals. At first, I did too. Living in the countryside, you get used to strange noises, the creaks and groans of old wood settling under the weight of snow, the distant howls of wolves echoing through the forest. It's normal. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But then there were the footprints. It was the middle of the week, late afternoon, and the light was already fading, the sky a bruised gray. I was heading out to the woodpile, as I did every day, boots crunching through the fresh layer of snow. That's when I saw them. Tracks, faint but unmistakable, leading from the trees toward the cabin. At first, I figured it was just a deer, but as I got closer, I realized these were too big, too wide, and too deep. They weren't hoof prints. They looked human. I crouched down to get a better look, my breath clouding in the cold air. The prints were uneven, like someone had been limping or dragging one leg. There was no sign of any other disturbance, just those tracks leading right up to the edge of the clearing where my cabin stood. Then they stopped. No return prints, no sign of movement away. It was as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. I stood there for a long time, staring at the snow, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was someone from the village, I thought. A hunter, maybe, passing through. But I knew how unlikely that was. No one from town ever came this far out unless they had a reason, and certainly not in this weather. The cold was biting, and anyone out here would have been bundled up in heavy furs, yet there were no signs of dragging or the wide tracks snowshoes would leave behind. Just those strange, dragging footprints. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing, just the snow playing tricks on me. I went back inside, stoked the fire, and tried to forget about it. But the next morning, the footprints were there again. This time, they were closer to the cabin, circling it in a loose, meandering path. The snow was deep and the wind had howled through the night, but those prints stayed, clear as day. I hadn't heard a thing, hadn't seen anything, but they were there. That sick feeling started to rise in my gut again, the same one I'd been ignoring for weeks. Something was wrong. I grabbed my axe and followed the tracks, even though every instinct told me not to. They led back into the woods, toward the thickest part of the forest, where the trees grew so close together the snow barely touched the ground. As I got deeper into the trees, the light dimmed, the air growing colder. The tracks disappeared at the edge of a rocky outcrop, the snow too patchy to hold any impressions. I stood there for a while, my heart hammering in my chest, listening to the silence. Then there was a sound, soft, almost imperceptible. A scraping, like something hard dragging across stone. I froze, gripping the handle of the axe tighter. The noise came again, this time closer. I could feel the weight of something watching me, just beyond the trees, just out of sight. My mouth went dry, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. Movement, a flicker of shadow between the trees. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and hurried back to the cabin, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise as if something was right behind me, following. But when I reached the clearing, the woods were silent again, as if nothing had ever been there. That night, I barred the door and sat by the fire, my axe resting across my knees. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it finally did, I dreamt of glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. The next morning, the tracks were there again, even closer than before. Something or someone was out there, and they weren't going away. The uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me was no longer something I could ignore. Whatever was lurking in those woods wasn't natural. The day I saw it for the first time, the air was so still it felt like the world had stopped. It was the kind of cold that goes deeper than your skin, straight into your bones, as if the entire forest had been frozen in time. I'd been chopping wood for hours, the rhythmic thunk of the axe breaking the silence, my breath puffing in front of me like smoke. My body was moving on autopilot, just trying to stay warm, keep busy, and push away the growing sense of unease that had settled over me in the past few days. Then I felt it. I can't explain exactly how I knew. It wasn't a sound, and it wasn't something I saw right away. It was just a feeling, an instinct maybe, that told me something was out there, watching. I froze, the axe hanging mid-swing, my body tensing as a chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. Slowly, I turned my head toward the edge of the forest, where the trees stood thick and dark against the snow. And there, just beyond the first row of pines, I saw it. At first, I didn't believe what I was seeing. My brain struggled to process it, to make sense of the shape. It was tall, much taller than any man, its figure almost blending into the shadows, like it was made from the forest itself. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it knew I was watching, but didn't care. Its skin, if you could even call it skin, was mottled in gray, hanging off its body like ragged cloth. The thing looked ancient, as if it had been buried under the earth for centuries and had only just clawed its way free. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They glowed, not with the bright, sharp light you'd expect from an animal caught in the dark, but with a dull, smoldering ember-like hue. They seemed to burn from deep within its skull, casting a faint red glow over the snow. Those eyes locked onto mine, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. It was like time had slowed down, and in that moment, I knew this was no animal, no person. This was something else, something old, something wrong. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. My mind raced back to the stories I'd heard as a child, the tales the old men told in the village about the Draugr. Undead warriors, cursed to wander the earth, searching for something they'd lost. I hadn't believed those stories, not really. They were just ghost tales, something to scare kids around the fire. But now, staring into the glowing eyes of the thing lurking in the woods, those stories felt very, very real. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, the creature watching me, and me too terrified to move. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts, each one clouding the cold air. I knew I should run, should scream, should do something, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped in the gaze of this thing that shouldn't exist. Then, without warning, it moved. Slowly, it turned and melted back into the shadows of the trees, its massive form disappearing between the trunks as if it had never been there at all. The forest swallowed it whole, and suddenly the world snapped back into focus. The wind returned, the trees rustled, and I was alone again. But I wasn't. I could feel it. It was still there, just out of sight, watching from the dark. I dropped the axe, my hands trembling so hard I could barely stand. Stumbling back to the cabin, I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my chest heaving as I pressed my back against the wood. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, but no matter how many explanations I tried to come up with, no matter how hard I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, the truth was impossible to ignore. I had seen the Draugr, and it had seen me. That night, I sat by the fire, unable to sleep. The image of those glowing eyes burned into my mind. The woods outside were silent again, but I knew better now. The stories weren't just stories. Something had come out of the darkness, and I had a feeling it wasn't going to leave. Not until it got what it wanted. The stories of the Draugr had always been there, like background noise in the village, something that the old folks spoke of in hushed tones when the wind howled just right, or when someone went missing for a few days. Growing up, I had dismissed it all as folklore, tales to scare children into staying close to home, tales to explain things that didn't have any real explanation. But after that night, the night I saw those glowing eyes in the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that those stories were more than just old myths. I found myself remembering the whispers I'd overheard in the village tavern, the way the old men's faces would grow dark and serious when the subject came up. The Draugr wasn't just some ghost or monster, it was something worse. The legend said they were the restless dead, the bodies of long-forgotten warriors or cursed men who couldn't find peace in the afterlife. Their souls were trapped in their decaying bodies, doomed to wander the wilderness, seeking out the living to torment, or worse. The stories varied, depending on who you asked. Some said the Draugr were nothing more than walking corpses, aimless and mindless, driven by hunger or rage. Others claimed they were more than that, creatures of cunning and malice, with the ability to think and plan, to stalk their prey over days, weeks, months if necessary. They could appear and disappear at will, slipping through the shadows like smoke, and there was no way to know when they would strike. I never believed those tales before, but now, sitting in the flickering light of the fire, I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me. The creature I had seen, it wasn't just some wandering animal. It was watching me, and I could feel it in my gut that it wasn't going to stop. I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, to convince myself that I was overreacting, letting old stories cloud my judgment. After all, the village had always been there, and the people had lived here for generations. They had survived the winters, the wolves, and whatever else lurked in the woods. If the Draugr were real, surely there would be more signs, more disappearances, more evidence. But then I remembered. I remembered the stories about how the Draugr didn't always take their victims right away. Sometimes they would toy with them, creeping closer and closer until their target was too tired, too scared, too broken to fight back. It was a slow kind of horror, the kind that wormed its way into your mind and made you question everything. I thought about the footprints I'd seen around my cabin, the dragging marks that led to the woods and never came back. I thought about the uneasy feeling I had been living with, the sense that I was being watched, hunted. Maybe that was the worst part, knowing that I was being toyed with, that whatever was out there had already chosen me. The stories always said that the Draugr didn't just kill their victims outright. No, they liked to watch first, to make their prey squirm, to see the fear in their eyes. I spent the next few days trying to go about my normal routine, chopping wood, keeping the fire going, trying to convince myself that nothing was out of the ordinary. But it was always there, the knowledge that I was being watched. I stopped going out into the woods after dark, stopped wandering too far from the cabin. And still, every morning I would find the tracks, closer and closer to the cabin, always circling as if it was waiting for something. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I made the trek back into the village, my heart pounding in my chest the whole way. The air felt colder, thicker, as if the forest itself was watching me now. When I reached the village, I went straight to the tavern, found the oldest man I could, and asked him outright about the Draugr. His eyes widened, and he glanced over his shoulder as if the very mention of the creature could bring it into being. He didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was low, barely more than a whisper. "You've seen it, haven't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. "The Draugr don't come for everyone," he said, his eyes narrowing. "They choose their prey, and once they've chosen, there's no going back. It will watch, it will wait, and when it's ready, well, you'll know." I left the village that night with a sinking feeling in my gut, knowing I was being hunted by something far older and far darker than I'd ever imagined. The days stretched on, each one colder and darker than the last. The sun barely made an appearance anymore, just a faint glow behind the thick clouds that hung low over the horizon. The village, small and distant, felt like a memory I could no longer touch. I stopped going there, stopped talking to anyone. I was too ashamed to admit what was happening to me, too afraid they'd think I'd lost my mind. The villagers would whisper if they knew I'd been asking about the Draugr. Worse, they might stop whispering altogether. The feeling of being watched never went away. Every time I stepped outside, I felt it. Those eyes on me, unseen but undeniable, always lurking just beyond the reach of the light. It wasn't just in the woods anymore either. Even inside the cabin, I felt its presence. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. The fire would crackle and pop, the wind would whistle against the windows, but in the silence between those noises I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. The sound of something moving outside, something slow and deliberate pacing just beyond the walls. It started with small things at first. The snow around the cabin was always disturbed, the tracks leading closer and closer each morning. Then I noticed the door. One morning, I found it slightly ajar, even though I knew I'd locked it the night before. Nothing inside was disturbed, nothing stolen, but it was enough to send a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a cage. The walls seemed too thin, too fragile to keep anything out. Every creak in the wood, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, made my skin crawl. I found myself checking the locks over and over again, pacing the small space with my axe close at hand, as if that would somehow protect me from whatever was out there. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. You can't fight something like this. Not with an axe. Not with anything. The worst part was the isolation. The village had always been distant, but now it felt like I was living on another planet entirely. I didn't dare go into town, didn't dare face the villagers and their knowing looks. What would I tell them anyway? That I was being stalked by a creature from their darkest folklore? That I was slowly losing my grip on reality, haunted by something I couldn't even fully explain? No, I stayed here, in the cabin, alone with my thoughts and my fear, the walls closing in tighter and tighter each day. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Those glowing embers, watching from the edge of the trees, waiting. I started keeping the fire going all night, even though I knew it wouldn't help. Fire couldn't keep out what I was dealing with, but it was something to do, something to distract myself from the gnawing dread that had taken up permanent residence in my gut. The creature didn't show itself again, not fully, but I knew it was still there. I could hear it. Some nights, after the fire had died down and the wind was still, I'd hear the faintest sound outside, a scraping, like something heavy being dragged across the frozen ground. It was slow, methodical, like it knew I was listening, like it wanted me to hear it. I'd sit by the fire, gripping the axe so tightly my knuckles went white, my breath shallow and rapid, waiting for the sound to stop. But it never really did. It was always there, just on the edge of my hearing, a reminder that I wasn't alone. The isolation, the fear, it was wearing me down. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Every time I stepped outside, I half expected to see the creature standing there, just waiting. But it didn't need to be seen to terrify me. The knowledge that it was out there, that it was watching and waiting, was enough to unravel me. I could barely sleep, barely eat. The simplest tasks became impossible. My thoughts were a tangled mess of fear and confusion, and there was no one I could turn to, no one who would understand. The isolation had become more than just a physical reality. It was a prison, and the walls were closing in. Something had to give. I knew that. The Draugr was playing a game with me, wearing me down, and soon it would come for me. It was only a matter of time. It happened on a night colder than any I'd ever known. The fire burned low, casting long shadows that danced across the walls of the cabin. I'd been sitting in my chair, staring at the flames, trying to keep my mind from spiraling into the darkness that had been creeping up on me for weeks. The axe was still beside me, its cold metal handle within reach, but by then, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Something was out there. Something worse than wolves or the biting cold. And tonight, it was coming for me. The wind outside had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its place. That silence was somehow worse than the howling gusts. It was like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that heavy sense of dread that had been growing day by day. The feeling that whatever had been stalking me was no longer content to stay in the shadows. I heard it before I saw it, a scraping sound, slow and deliberate, coming from just outside the cabin. It was the same noise I'd been hearing for days, but this time it was louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like a hammer blow, and I gripped the axe tighter. I didn't move, didn't dare breathe, straining to hear through the oppressive silence. The scraping continued, followed by a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but more distant, more hollow. The kind of sound that reverberates in your chest, making your bones feel weak. I knew then, without a doubt, that it had come for me. Suddenly, the front door rattled violently in its frame, as if something heavy had slammed against it. My whole body went rigid with terror, the axe slipping slightly in my sweat-slicked hands. I forced myself to stand, every muscle tense, and moved slowly toward the door. The rattling stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving only the echo of it ringing in my ears. For a second there was nothing, just silence. I half hoped that it was gone, that maybe it had been scared off by the noise of the door, but deep down I knew better. A sharp crack split the air, the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. My eyes darted to the small window by the door, and I froze. There, just outside the glass, was a face. Not human, not even close. Its skin was pale, gray, stretched tight over the bones, and its eyes, those terrible, glowing embers, burned in the darkness like the last light of a dying fire. They locked onto mine through the window, and I felt my blood turn to ice. It was the Draugr. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just my imagination or the old stories playing tricks on me. It was real, and it was here. The thing stared at me through the glass for what felt like an eternity, its head tilted slightly to the side, almost as if it was curious. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it raised one of its massive, gnarled hands and pressed it against the window. The glass fogged beneath its touch, frost spreading outward like veins. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the sight of it. And then it smiled. The grin that split its face was unnatural, stretching far too wide, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. The kind of smile you'd see on a corpse, mocking and empty. I knew it was toying with me, savoring the moment. This was the endgame. It had hunted me, stalked me, and now it was going to finish what it had started. With a sudden, deafening crash, the door burst inward, wood splintering in every direction. The wind rushed in, bringing with it the freezing cold and the stench of rot. The Draugr stepped into the cabin, its massive frame filling the doorway, the firelight flickering wildly against its decaying form. It moved slowly, deliberately, its eyes never leaving mine. I raised the axe, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it, but I knew it was pointless. The creature loomed over me, its breath coming in slow, rattling gasps that filled the room with the stench of death. This close, I could see the details of its face, the sunken, hollow cheeks, the skin stretched so tight over its skull that it seemed ready to tear apart at any moment. Those eyes, still burning with that faint, smoldering light, bored into me like they were peering straight into my soul. For a moment, everything was silent again. The world seemed to stop, the cold and fear coiling around me like a vice. Then it lunged. I swung the axe, but it was too fast. There was a flash of movement, a blur of rotting flesh and glowing eyes, and then everything went dark. When I woke, the cold was the first thing I felt. It wasn't just the usual winter chill. This was something deeper, more penetrating, like ice flowing through my veins. My body ached all over, every muscle screaming in protest as I tried to move. My head throbbed, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was dead or alive. The last thing I remembered was the Draugr lunging at me, its decaying face twisted in that horrific, mocking grin. Then, nothing. I blinked my eyes open slowly, my vision blurred and unfocused. I was lying on the floor of the cabin, the splintered door hanging crookedly from its hinges. The fire had gone out, leaving the room in a deep, bone-chilling cold. My breath hung in the air like mist, and I could hear the faint whistle of wind creeping through the cracks in the walls. But there was something else. A sound. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the distant creak of wood settling, or footsteps. I forced myself to sit up, wincing as my body protested with every movement. The axe was still lying on the floor beside me, untouched, useless. I grabbed it, if only for the comfort of having something in my hands, and looked around. The cabin was empty. No sign of the Draugr, no sign of anything out of the ordinary, except for the door hanging off its hinges, the wood splintered and broken where the creature had forced its way in. But it was gone. I stood slowly, trying to steady myself, my legs shaky and weak. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. Why was I still alive? The Draugr had me, cornered and helpless. I was sure I had felt its breath, cold and foul, just inches from my face before everything went black. And yet here I was, alive. I took a cautious step toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Outside, the snow stretched on endlessly, a blanket of white undisturbed except for the jagged remains of the door. The tracks, the ones I had been seeing for days, were gone. No sign of anything, no marks in the snow, no footprints leading away. It was as if the creature had vanished without a trace. I should have felt relief. I should have been grateful to be alive, to have survived the encounter. But all I felt was dread, a deep, gnawing fear that this wasn't over. The cabin was silent, but that silence felt wrong, like it was hiding something just beyond the edge of hearing. I didn't want to stay. I couldn't. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound too loud. I needed to get out, to put distance between myself and whatever had happened here. Without thinking, I threw on my coat, grabbed what little I could, and stepped outside into the snow. The cold hit me like a slap, but it was a relief compared to the oppressive weight of the cabin. I stood there for a moment, staring into the forest, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me from the trees. But there was nothing. Just the wind and the snow. I started walking, heading toward the village. The snow crunched under my boots, and the sound was almost comforting, a reminder that I was still here, still alive. But as I walked, the sense of being watched never left me. Every step I took, I felt it. Eyes on me, hidden somewhere in the darkness of the forest. I reached the village by nightfall. The small houses huddled together like they were trying to keep warm. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the lights in the windows were soft and inviting. But even here, something felt off. The streets were empty, quieter than usual. I knocked on the door of the tavern, hoping for warmth, for company, for answers. The old man who answered didn't look surprised to see me, but there was something in his eyes, something dark and knowing. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. Instead, he just looked at me for a long moment and then said, "It's not over, you know." My heart sank. "They don't just let you go," he continued, his voice low and grave. "Once the Draugr has chosen you, it's never truly gone. It may leave for a time, but it'll be back. It always comes back." I wanted to argue, to say he was wrong, that I had survived. But deep down, I knew he was right. The creature had let me go, for now. But it was still out there, somewhere in the woods, watching, waiting. I didn't know when it would return, or why it had chosen me. But as I sat there in the warmth of the tavern, surrounded by the flicker of firelight, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. And next time, I might not be so lucky.